Why won't this master key open your car? This is a violation. That's what shattered my Saturday morning silence at 7:12 a.m. I stepped out of the garage with coffee still steaming in my hand and found HOA Karen bent over my driver's door like a burglar in broad daylight, metal shrieking as she violently jammed key after key into my lock. She spun around in her neon safety vest, clipboard raised like a badge. "All vehicles must allow emergency HOA access," she snapped. "Your lock is illegally modified." I said nothing. One key bent. Another snapped clean in half. On the sixth failed key, her face went pale with fury. She yanked out her phone and hit 911. "There's a suspicious vehicle with tampered locks," she told dispatch, "and the resident is obstructing an official safety inspection." She pointed at me like I was already in handcuffs. What she didn't realize was that this single phone call was about to hand her every charge she'd avoided for years. And when the first officer arrived, everything about her authority collapsed in seconds. "Drop your city below. Karen's about to learn what real authority looks like." Let me back up and give you some context about how I ended up living next to the most unhinged woman in suburban America. My name is Connor Blake, and up until 6 months ago, my life looked completely different. My wife Sarah and I had been married for 20 years, raising twin boys, Jake and Ryan, in a quiet neighborhood about 30 miles from here. Sarah was the kind of woman who could fix a leaky faucet in the morning, help with calculus homework in the afternoon, and still have energy to build elaborate birdhouses with me in the evenings. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in March, everything changed. Sarah was driving home from her nursing job when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car head-on. The smell of hospital disinfectant and the sound of heart monitors still haunts my dreams. The boys were 16 then, old enough to understand that mom wasn't coming home, but young enough that the grief hit them like a freight train. After the funeral, our old house felt like a museum of memories we weren't ready to face. The boys were struggling in school, I was barely functioning at work, and every room reminded us of the laughter we'd lost. So when my supervisor suggested a transfer to the regional office here in Willowbrook, we decided a fresh start might help us heal. That's how we ended up in Willowbrook Estates, a cookie-cutter suburban development where every house looks exactly the same except for the color of the shutters. The realtor promised us it was a quiet family community, with excellent HOA oversight. What she failed to mention was that the HOA oversight came in the form of Karen Ashford, a woman who'd apparently appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial vehicle enforcement officer. Karen's background was a masterclass in petty authority gone wrong. She'd worked at the local DMV office for 15 years before being encouraged to pursue other opportunities, which is corporate speak for fired for harassing customers. Apparently, Karen had a habit of rejecting perfectly valid paperwork because she didn't like people's attitudes, and after enough complaints, the state finally showed her the door. But instead of learning her lesson, Karen doubled down on her control issues. She moved to Willowbrook Estates and immediately began inserting herself into every aspect of neighborhood management. She created her own title, Vehicle Safety Coordinator, and printed business cards that listed her email address as safetyrstwillowbrook@gmail.com. The fact that this position didn't actually exist in the HOA bylaws was apparently just a minor detail. Karen's appearance was as ridiculous as her authority complex. She wore that fluorescent safety vest everywhere, to the grocery store, to church, to neighborhood barbecues. It was paired with a clipboard that contained exactly one piece of paper, a document she'd typed up called Willowbrook Estates Vehicle Regulations, written entirely in Comic Sans font. The jangling sound of her key ring could be heard from 3 houses away, and she carried it like a sheriff carries a badge. The woman had convinced herself that she owned a set of master keys that could open any vehicle in the neighborhood. What she actually owned was a $47 universal car key set she'd bought on some sketchy website, along with a collection of random keys she'd picked up at garage sales. But in Karen's mind, these keys represented ultimate authority over everything with 4 wheels and an engine. Here's what I didn't know at the time. Karen had been testing her master key authority on other neighbors for months. She'd successfully entered at least 6 different vehicles in our neighborhood, stealing loose change from cup holders, copying registration information, and even taking garage door openers. Most of the victims thought they were losing their minds. Stuff kept disappearing from their cars, documents kept moving around, and nobody could figure out why. The irony is that I moved to this neighborhood specifically to avoid drama. After Sarah's death, all I wanted was a quiet place where my boys could finish high school and I could figure out how to be a single father. Instead, I'd unknowingly moved in next door to a woman whose hobby was breaking into cars and whose day job was making everyone else's life miserable. And that brings us back to Saturday morning, 7 a.m., with the sound of metal scratching against metal and Karen Ashford about to discover that her fake master keys were no match for actual federal law enforcement training. When Karen's seventh key failed to open my car door, I watched her face cycle through confusion, frustration, and then pure rage in about 15 seconds flat. She stepped back from my vehicle, pulled out her phone, and proceeded to make the most dramatic 911 call I've ever witnessed. "I need police immediately," she announced loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "We have a suspicious federal vehicle with tampered locks and a resident who's refusing to comply with community safety inspection protocols." I had to give her credit for creativity. In the span of 30 seconds, she'd managed to transform her failed break-in attempt into a national security threat. She paced back and forth in my driveway, gesturing wildly with her free hand, while explaining to the dispatcher that I was possibly impersonating a federal officer and that my vehicle was blocking emergency access routes. The emergency access route, by the way, was my own driveway. Within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived with lights flashing. I could see neighbors emerging from their houses like prairie dogs popping out of holes, phones already in hand to capture whatever drama was about to unfold. My 16-year-old sons appeared at our front window, and I could see Jake asking Ryan, "What did Dad do now?" The responding officers were professionals I'd actually worked with on joint operations. Detective Martinez and Officer Johnson from the County Sheriff's Department. They approached with that careful neutrality cops use when they're dealing with what's probably a nuisance call, but could potentially be something serious. "Morning, Connor," Martinez said, recognizing me immediately. "Got a call about some kind of vehicle situation?" Before I could respond, Karen launched into a presentation that would have made a trial lawyer proud. She explained that she was the neighborhood's duly appointed vehicle safety coordinator, that she had legitimate authority to inspect all vehicles for compliance violations, and that I was obstructing official HOA business by refusing to allow her access to my car. "He's got some kind of illegal anti-theft modification," she declared, waving her key ring like evidence. "My master keys work on every vehicle in this community, but his locks have been tampered with to prevent legitimate safety inspections." Officer Johnson looked at me with barely concealed amusement. "Connor, you want to explain what's happening here?" "Ma'am," I said, addressing Karen directly, "these officers can verify my federal credentials, but I'm curious, do you have any documentation showing you have legal authority to enter private vehicles?" That's when Karen produced her laminated Vehicle Safety Coordinator certificate, which looked like something a kid might make for a school project. The officers examined it politely while I requested an incident report number and asked them to document Karen's claims about having master key authority over neighborhood vehicles. Here's something most people don't realize. When someone makes false statements to police officers about federal employees, it can actually constitute obstruction of justice. Even if the person making the claims genuinely believes they're in the right, the fact pattern can escalate quickly into federal jurisdiction. But the real mini-twist came after the officers left. Despite having watched them verify my federal credentials and badge, Karen immediately began telling the gathered neighbors that my identification was obviously fake and that the police were clearly part of some kind of cover-up. "Real federal agents don't live in family neighborhoods," she announced to anyone who would listen. "This is obviously some kind of scam, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it, Mrs." Patterson from across the street actually apologized to me privately, explaining that Karen had been having issues with several families lately. But what really caught my attention was when she mentioned that Karen had been asking questions about vehicles belonging to other residents, specifically whether anyone else had government-looking cars. As I watched Karen march back to her house, still clutching her ridiculous key ring and muttering about federal conspiracies, I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time incident. This was a woman who had convinced herself she had authority she didn't possess, and my presence in her neighborhood represented a direct challenge to the fantasy world she'd constructed. That afternoon, I started a federal incident file. Not because I was particularly worried about Karen's threats, but because 22 years of law enforcement experience had taught me that people like Karen don't just give up and go away, they escalate. And when they escalate against federal employees, things can get very complicated very quickly. Sure enough, Monday morning brought a hand-delivered envelope containing the first of what would become a series of increasingly creative violation notices. Monday morning's violation notice was a work of art, if by art you mean completely delusional legal fiction. Karen had hand-delivered a document titled Official HOA Compliance Violation that accused me of unauthorized federal vehicle storage on residential property, commercial equipment display in family neighborhood, and my personal favorite, failure to comply with community master key access protocols. The financial penalties were equally creative. According to Karen's calculations, I owed $500 in various fines, $200 for the vehicle violation, $150 for the commercial equipment charge, and $150 for obstruction of community safety inspection. She'd even included a payment schedule and threatened to place a lien on my house if the fines weren't paid within 30 days. But Karen wasn't content to limit her harassment to paperwork. Over the next week, she began what I can only describe as a targeted campaign against my entire family. She approached my teenage sons directly, questioning whether they had proper authorization to live in a family neighborhood with a federal presence. When Jake told her to leave him alone, she accused him of being trained in intimidation tactics. She also started a petition that she circulated door to door, asking neighbors to sign a request to remove federal surveillance operations from residential areas. According to Mrs. Patterson, who refused to sign, Karen claimed I was conducting undercover operations that put local families at risk. The social media campaign was perhaps the most ridiculous part. Karen created a Facebook group called Willowbrook Safety Watch and began posting photos of my vehicle that she'd taken from the public street. Her captions read like spy novel excerpts. Federal vehicle observed at residential location for extended periods. Occupant claims to be U.S. Marshal but refuses community verification protocols. The posts attracted a mix of responses, from neighbors who knew me and defended my family to complete strangers who apparently believed that federal employees shouldn't be allowed to live in suburban neighborhoods. The comment threads became increasingly heated, with Karen responding to every defense of my family by questioning whether my supporters were also involved in federal operations. Meanwhile, the fake fines kept coming. Karen had apparently appointed herself to multiple HOA positions that didn't exist, and each one generated new violation notices. As architectural review coordinator, she cited me for having non-residential window tinting. As community standards supervisor, she fined me for displaying federal insignia in civilian area. The creativity was almost impressive. The harassment was affecting my sons' social lives. Their friends' parents were starting to ask questions about why we had police cars at our house, why some neighborhood lady was posting about us on Facebook, and whether it was safe for their kids to visit. Jake came home one day and asked me directly, "Dad, are we going to have to move again?" That question hit harder than any of Karen's ridiculous fines. These boys had already lost their mother and their childhood home. They'd started over in a new school, made new friends, and begun the slow process of rebuilding their lives. The idea that one woman's harassment campaign might force us to uproot again was unacceptable. So I decided to do what I do best: investigate. I spent the weekend reading through the actual HOA bylaws, which were publicly available documents filed with the county. What I discovered was fascinating. Not only did Karen lack any official authority to issue fines or inspect vehicles, but most of the positions she'd claimed for herself didn't exist at all. The real HOA board consisted of 5 elected residents who handled basic neighborhood maintenance and communal area upkeep. There was no vehicle safety coordinator, no architectural review coordinator, and definitely no community standards supervisor. Karen had literally invented an entire bureaucratic structure and appointed herself to run it. Even better, I started talking to other neighbors who had received Karen's attention over the past 18 months. Tom Henderson had been fined for unauthorized lawn ornaments after putting up a small American flag. Maria Santos received violation notices for culturally inappropriate landscaping because she'd planted vegetables instead of decorative flowers. The elderly couple at the end of our street had been threatened with property liens because their adult son's pickup truck violated community aesthetic standards. Here's a legal nugget that most people don't know. Issuing fake fines and threatening property liens when you have no legal authority to do so can constitute fraud, especially if you're demanding payment. If someone pays those fake fines, it becomes theft by deception under most state laws. The mini twist came when I contacted the actual HOA president, a mild-mannered guy named David Chen who worked as an accountant. When I asked him about Karen's various coordinator positions, he went completely silent for about 10 seconds. "Oh no," he finally said. "We've been wondering why people kept asking us about violation notices we never sent. We thought maybe our mail was getting mixed up." It turns out the real HOA board had been dealing with confused residents for months, people calling to ask about fines they'd supposedly received or demanding explanations for violations they'd allegedly committed. The board had assumed it was some kind of administrative error and kept telling people to ignore any notices they couldn't verify. David also revealed something that changed my entire perspective on the situation. The board had been afraid to confront Karen directly because she'd threatened to sue them for harassment of a volunteer coordinator. She'd convinced them that challenging her authority would result in legal action, so they'd been trying to handle the situation through passive non-engagement. But now that I'd connected the dots and realized Karen was essentially running a fraudulent parallel HOA, the real board was ready to take action. David agreed to provide me with official documentation proving that none of Karen's positions existed and that she had no authority to issue any kind of violations or fines. Armed with this information, I felt like I was finally ready to turn the tables, but Karen, apparently sensing that her authority was being questioned, decided to escalate to physical harassment. Wednesday morning, I discovered that Karen had moved beyond paperwork and into actual physical interference. Sometime during the night, she had attached what looked like a steering wheel lock device to my front tire, along with a bright orange notice that read, "Vehicle impounded by Community Authority. Contact Safety Coordinator for release." The lock itself was one of those anti-theft clubs you can buy at any auto parts store for about $30. But Karen had covered it with official-looking stickers that said Willowbrook Impound and Authorized Personnel Only. And she'd even laminated a fake badge that identified her as a certified vehicle inspector, complete with a photo that looked like it was taken at a mall kiosk. The timing was particularly cruel. My sons needed to drive to school, and I had to be in federal court by 9 a.m. for a warrant hearing. Instead, I was standing in my driveway at 7:30 in the morning, staring at a $30 car lock that had been installed by a woman who apparently believed she had the authority to impound vehicles in her own neighborhood. But here's where Karen made a critical mistake. She hadn't just disappeared after installing the lock. She was standing on her front porch, wearing her fluorescent safety vest and holding her clipboard, apparently waiting to see how I would respond to her latest escalation. When she saw me examining the lock, she called out across the street, "You'll need to contact the vehicle safety coordinator to arrange for release of your impounded vehicle. There's a $50 impound fee plus daily storage charges." I have to admit there was something almost admirable about the woman's commitment to her fantasy. She'd moved from fake violation notices to actual physical interference, but she was still maintaining the fiction that this was all legitimate community safety enforcement. That's when I decided to give Karen exactly what she wanted: a response. I pulled out my phone and started recording as I walked across the street toward her house. "Ma'am," I said loudly enough for any neighbors to hear, "I need to clarify something with you. You've attached a device to my personal vehicle. Are you claiming legal authority to impound cars in this neighborhood?" Karen straightened up like a soldier coming to attention. "As the duly appointed vehicle safety coordinator for Willowbrook Estates, I have full authority to immobilize any vehicle that poses a safety risk to the community." "And who appointed you to this position?" "The HOA board recognizes my expertise in vehicle safety protocols." "Have you received any formal training in vehicle safety inspection?" "I have 15 years of experience in vehicle documentation and registration procedures." It was a fascinating conversation to have on camera. Karen was providing clear, documented statements about her claimed authority while standing on a public street where her voice would carry to any neighbors who might be listening. More importantly, she was making specific claims about her appointment and training that could be easily verified or disproven. The sound of metal clanking filled the air as Karen adjusted her massive keyring, and I noticed something interesting. Several of the keys had small pieces of tape attached with house numbers written on them. It looked suspiciously like she'd been organizing her master keys by address. While I was talking to Karen, I activated the motion sensor cameras I'd quietly installed around my property the previous weekend. What I captured over the next few days would reveal the true scope of Karen's vehicle safety program. The footage showed Karen making regular rounds through the neighborhood, typically in the early morning or late evening when most people weren't outside. She would approach parked vehicles, test her various keys in the locks, and when successful, spend several minutes inside the cars going through glove compartments, center consoles, and door pockets. Over a 2-week period, I documented her illegally entering 6 different neighbor vehicles. She wasn't just testing locks, she was systematically stealing loose change, copying registration information, and in one case actually taking a garage door opener from the Henderson family's SUV. Here's a law enforcement fact that most civilians don't realize. Once someone establishes a pattern of vehicle break-ins across multiple victims, it stops being simple theft and starts being considered organized criminal activity. If the perpetrator is using tools or techniques that suggest planning and sophistication, like multiple keys organized by address, prosecutors can argue for enhanced charges. But the real mini-twist came when Mrs. Patterson approached me privately to share something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. She'd been keeping a log of her own after noticing items disappearing from her car, and her documentation revealed that Karen's master key operations had been going on for over a year. "I thought I was losing my mind," she told me. "My car registration kept moving around and I was missing about $15 in quarters from my cup holder, but then I saw your cameras and realized I wasn't crazy." Mrs. Patterson had also been quietly talking to other neighbors, and it turned out that at least 8 families had noticed similar problems. Missing change, moved documents, the occasional missing garage door remote or parking permit. Everyone had assumed they were either forgetful or possibly dealing with teenage pranks. The most disturbing revelation was that Karen had apparently been using stolen garage door openers to access people's homes when they weren't present. The Henderson family had noticed that items in their garage workshop were occasionally moved around, but they'd attributed it to their teenage son borrowing tools and forgetting to put them back. When I shared this information with my supervisor at the marshal's office, his response was immediate. "Connor, this isn't HOA harassment anymore. This is interstate theft, breaking and entering, and possibly stalking. We need to involve the local prosecutor." That evening, as I was reviewing my camera footage and preparing to contact federal prosecutors, Karen made her boldest move yet. She appeared at my front door at 8 p.m., still wearing her safety vest, carrying her clipboard, and flanked by 2 people I'd never seen before. "Mr. Blake," she announced formally, "I'm here with representatives from the Willowbrook Community Standards Review Board to conduct an official inspection of your federal vehicle registration and community compliance documentation." The representatives turned out to be her brother-in-law and a woman from her book club, both of whom looked deeply uncomfortable with whatever Karen had convinced them to participate in. But this time, I was ready for her. That evening inspection visit was Karen's biggest mistake because it gave me the perfect opportunity to conduct my own investigation. While she was demanding to see my vehicle registration and federal parking permits, documents that don't actually exist, I was asking her representatives some very interesting questions. "So you're with the Community Standards Review Board," I said to the uncomfortable-looking man standing behind Karen. "How long have you been serving in that position?" He glanced nervously at Karen. "I just help out when Karen needs—" "What he means," Karen interrupted, "is that he's a volunteer consultant on automotive safety standards." But her book club friend was less prepared for the questioning. When I asked about the board's official meeting schedule, she accidentally revealed that she'd only learned about her position that afternoon when Karen called asking for help with some federal agent who was giving her trouble. The whole performance fell apart within about 10 minutes. Karen's fake review board dissolved into awkward apologies and hasty departures, leaving her standing alone on my front porch, still clutching her clipboard and insisting that I was obstructing official community safety protocols. But the real revelation came the next day when I started analyzing the camera footage more systematically. I'd captured 2 weeks of Karen's nighttime activities, and what I discovered was much more extensive than simple car break-ins. The footage revealed a sophisticated criminal operation. Karen had successfully entered vehicles belonging to the Henderson family, the Santos family, the elderly Johnsons, the new family who'd moved in 3 months ago, and at least 4 other households I hadn't identified yet. She wasn't just stealing loose change. She was conducting systematic intelligence gathering. In each vehicle, Karen spent time photographing registration documents, insurance cards, and any official papers she could find. She was copying garage door remote codes, taking pictures of house keys hanging on keychains, and even photographing family photos that people kept in their cars. More disturbing, the footage showed her using stolen garage door openers to access at least 3 different homes when the families weren't present. She would spend 15 to 20 minutes inside each garage, apparently going through storage areas, tool collections, and anything else that caught her interest. Here's a federal crime fact that most people don't know. When someone uses stolen access devices to enter multiple homes and systematically photographs personal documents, it can be prosecuted under federal identity theft statutes. The interstate nature of the crimes, many of the victims had vehicles registered in different states, made it a federal matter. I spent the weekend creating a comprehensive evidence package. Photos, video timestamps, a detailed timeline of criminal activities, and witness statements from 8 different neighbor families. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Karen Ashford was running a criminal enterprise out of Willowbrook Estates. Monday morning, I called the federal prosecutor's office and scheduled a meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in fraud and identity theft cases. When I presented the evidence, her response was immediate. "Mr. Blake, this is a slam-dunk federal case. Serial breaking and entering, theft, identity document fraud, and what appears to be organized stalking of multiple families. We can proceed with charges immediately." But the most shocking revelation came when Prosecutor Walsh ran Karen's background through federal databases. It turned out that Willowbrook wasn't Karen's first neighborhood harassment campaign. Over the past 5 years, she'd lived in 3 different communities, and in each one, residents had filed complaints about a woman matching her description who claimed HOA authority she didn't possess. In her previous neighborhood, Karen had been banned from all community events after threatening to place liens on homes whose owners wouldn't pay her fake fines. Before that, she'd been cited by local police for harassment after conducting safety inspections of children's bicycles and attempting to charge parents for compliance violations. The pattern was clear. Karen would move to a new community, appoint herself to imaginary positions of authority, and begin systematically harassing residents until either the community took legal action or she decided to move on to fresh victims. But this time was different. This time, she'd targeted a federal law enforcement officer with 22 years of experience in criminal investigation. This time, she'd left a digital evidence trail. And this time, there would be consequences. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Instead of being the victim of Karen's harassment campaign, I was now a federal investigator with a prosecutable case against a serial criminal. Instead of wondering when her escalation would end, I could control the timeline for her arrest. But there was still one problem. Karen didn't know that her criminal enterprise had been exposed. She was still operating under the assumption that she had successfully intimidated me into compliance, which meant she was likely to continue escalating until someone got seriously hurt. Prosecutor Walsh and I agreed on a strategy. We would continue gathering evidence while allowing Karen to believe her harassment campaign was working. When she inevitably made her next move, we would be ready with federal warrants and a multi-agency arrest team. The key, Walsh explained, is letting her dig her own hole deep enough that there's no possibility of claiming this was all a misunderstanding or a civil matter. We want clear, undeniable evidence of criminal intent. That meant waiting for Karen to escalate one more time. Based on her established pattern, it was only a matter of days before she attempted something that would cross the line from harassment into serious criminal activity. Sure enough, Thursday afternoon, Karen made the move that would seal her fate. Thursday afternoon's escalation attempt was exactly what Prosecutor Walsh and I had been waiting for. Karen approached my house wearing a new costume, an orange construction vest with community enforcement written in black marker, and carrying what appeared to be an official citation book. She marched up to my front door and announced that she was conducting an emergency safety inspection of my property due to federal security violations that posed risks to neighborhood families. When I asked to see her credentials, she produced a laminated badge that identified her as Chief Safety Enforcement Officer, Willowbrook Protective Services. The fictitious agency was a new addition to Karen's fantasy. According to the documentation she showed me, Willowbrook Protective Services was a community-authorized security organization with full investigative and enforcement powers over residential safety violations. But this time, instead of arguing with her, I played along. "I appreciate you taking community safety seriously," I told her. "Can you give me a few days to review my security protocols and make sure everything's in compliance?" Karen seemed surprised by my cooperative attitude, but pleased that her authority was finally being recognized. She agreed to return the following Tuesday for a comprehensive compliance inspection, which would give me time to finalize the trap I'd been planning. Over the weekend, I put together the most elaborate sting operation of my career. The centerpiece was a hydraulic bollard system that my neighbor Pete, a retired civil engineer, had helped me design and install. Pete's background was perfect for the project. He'd spent 30 years designing security systems for government buildings, and he understood exactly what we were trying to accomplish. "You know," he told me while we were digging the installation trenches, "the bollards that protect the Pentagon work on the same basic principle we're using here. Hydraulic pressure, fail-safe mechanisms, and enough stopping power to immobilize a full-size truck." The system we installed was more sophisticated than anything you'd find in a typical residential driveway. Hidden hydraulic posts that could rise 3 feet in less than 2 seconds, motion sensors that detected approaching vehicles, and a remote control system that gave me complete control over activation timing. Here's a DIY security fact that most homeowners don't realize. Hydraulic bollard systems aren't just for government buildings anymore. You can install a residential version for around $2,000, and they're completely legal as long as they're on your own property. The key is proper installation and safety protocols. You want to stop intruders, not cause accidents. The legal strategy required coordination with multiple agencies. Prosecutor Walsh had prepared federal warrants for Karen's arrest, but we also needed local law enforcement ready to secure the scene and handle any complications that might arise during the arrest. Detective Martinez from the county sheriff's office agreed to position units nearby during Karen's scheduled inspection visit. We also arranged for a forensics team to be on standby for processing evidence from Karen's house and vehicle once the arrest warrants were executed. The media coordination was my idea. After 18 months of Karen's harassment campaign, the neighborhood deserved to see justice served publicly. I contacted Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter from Channel 7 News who'd covered several HOA fraud cases, and arranged for her crew to be present during the arrest. The financial calculations were straightforward but significant. 8 neighbor families had documented losses totaling over $2,000 in stolen property, plus additional damages from Karen's unauthorized entry into vehicles and homes. Federal prosecutors could also seek restitution for investigation costs and victim impact expenses. But the most important part of the planning was coordinating with the affected neighbors. Tom Henderson, Maria Santos, Mrs. Patterson, and 4 other families agreed to provide witness testimony and victim impact statements. For the first time in 18 months, the neighborhood was united against Karen's harassment instead of being isolated and confused by it. Martha Williams, a retired paralegal who lived 2 streets over, volunteered to help organize the documentation. She'd been keeping detailed records of Karen's activities since the fake fine notices started appearing, and her evidence files were more comprehensive than anything I'd compiled in my official capacity. "I've been waiting for someone to take this seriously," Martha told me while we reviewed her documentation. "That woman has made this neighborhood feel like a prison, and it's time for her to face consequences." The timeline for the operation was critical. Karen expected her comprehensive compliance inspection on Tuesday afternoon at 2 p.m. By Monday evening, all federal warrants would be finalized, local law enforcement would be positioned, and the media would be ready to document whatever happened during the confrontation. The technical explanation of the bollard system became a neighborhood conversation topic. Pete spent Sunday afternoon showing interested residents how the hydraulic mechanism worked, explaining the safety features, and discussing how similar systems could be installed on other properties. "The beauty of this design," Pete explained to a small crowd of neighbors, "is that it's completely reversible. Once the hydraulic pressure is released, the bollards retract completely and you'd never know they were there. But when activated, they can stop a 5,000-pound vehicle in its tracks." Several neighbors expressed interest in installing their own security upgrades. The Henderson family wanted motion-activated cameras, the Santos family asked about driveway alarms, and Mrs. Patterson inquired about upgrading her garage door security system. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, I felt like I was part of a real community, instead of just living in a neighborhood where everyone was afraid of one unhinged woman. Monday evening, everything was in position. Federal warrants signed and ready for execution, local law enforcement coordinated and positioned, media standing by for live coverage, and neighborhood witnesses prepared to document 18 months of Karen's criminal harassment campaign. All we needed was for Karen to show up for her fake inspection appointment and walk into the trap we'd spent weeks preparing. Tuesday morning, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching the street through my window. knowing that by evening, Karen Ashford's criminal enterprise would be Monday evening, brought an unexpected twist that almost derailed the entire operation. Instead of waiting for Tuesday's scheduled inspection, Karen decided to escalate her harassment campaign by filing official complaints against me with my federal agency. I discovered this when my supervisor, Deputy Chief Marshal Robert Torres, called me at home around 8 p.m. His tone was professional but concerned. "Connor, I've got some paperwork on my desk that I need to discuss with you. We received formal ethics violations, complaints about your conduct toward a civilian community volunteer. Want to explain what's going on?" Karen had apparently spent the weekend crafting a comprehensive complaint package that accused me of using my federal position to intimidate a lawful community safety coordinator. The documentation she submitted included photographs of my vehicle, copies of her fake violation notices, and a narrative that painted her as a concerned citizen being harassed by an out-of-control federal agent. The complaint alleged that I'd threatened her with arrest for performing legitimate HOA duties, used my federal credentials to obstruct community safety inspections, and created a climate of fear that prevented her from carrying out her appointed responsibilities. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that Karen had done her research. She'd filed the complaints with multiple federal agencies, not just the Marshal Service, but also with the Department of Justice Inspector General's Office and the Federal Ethics Office. Each agency would be required to investigate the allegations, even if they seemed frivolous. But here's where Karen's research backfired spectacularly. In preparing her complaints, she'd included detailed descriptions of her activities that provided additional evidence of her criminal behavior. She admitted to conducting vehicle safety inspections using master keys, described her authority to relocate non-compliant vehicles, and explained her system for documenting federal security violations in residential areas. Deputy Chief Torres listened carefully as I explained the actual situation and provided him with the evidence package I'd prepared for federal prosecutors. His response was immediate and reassuring. "Connor, this woman isn't filing ethics complaints. She's confessing to federal crimes in writing. I'm forwarding this entire package to our criminal investigation unit and recommending immediate prosecution." But Karen wasn't finished with her escalation campaign. Tuesday morning, she appeared on my doorstep at 7 a.m. wearing a new costume, a black uniform with security supervisor patches and what appeared to be a badge from a private security company. "Mr. Blake," she announced formally, "I'm here to inform you that Willowbrook Protective Services has been authorized by the Community Association to conduct enhanced security screening of your federal activities. Failure to comply will result in immediate notification to federal oversight agencies." The performance was impressive in its audacity. Karen had apparently spent Monday evening creating an entire fictional security company, complete with official-looking documentation and a uniform that might fool someone who wasn't paying close attention. She handed me a document titled Federal Employee Community Monitoring Protocol that outlined her authority to inspect my federal vehicle, review my work schedules, and monitor my communications for potential security risks to civilian populations. The document was 6 pages long and included references to fictional federal regulations, made-up community safety standards, and a completely imaginary legal framework that supposedly governed federal employees living in residential areas. But the most disturbing part was Karen's claim that she'd been coordinating with federal oversight agencies to investigate my pattern of intimidation and abuse of federal authority. She insisted that her ethics complaints had triggered a formal investigation and that I was now subject to enhanced community monitoring pending the outcome. Here's an important legal fact about federal employee harassment. Making false reports to federal agencies about federal employees can result in charges for obstruction of justice, making false statements to government agencies, and in some cases, terrorism-related offenses, if the false reports are designed to interfere with federal operations. The mini twist came when I asked Karen to provide contact information for the federal agencies she claimed to be working with. She produced a business card for Special Agent Patricia Morrison, Federal Employee Oversight Division, with a phone number that, when I called it later, turned out to be Karen's own cell phone with a fake voicemail message. Karen had created an entire fictional federal investigation, appointed herself as the liaison officer, and was now claiming authority to monitor my activities on behalf of agencies that didn't exist and officials she'd invented. But instead of confronting her about the obvious fraud, I continued playing along. I told Karen that I wanted to be fully cooperative with any legitimate federal investigation and asked her to schedule a comprehensive meeting where I could provide all the documentation she needed. "I think it would be best if we handled this officially," I suggested. Perhaps you could arrange for your federal contacts to be present so we can resolve any concerns directly." Karen seemed pleased that her authority was finally being taken seriously. She agreed to arrange a meeting for the following day, promising to bring appropriate federal oversight personnel to conduct a thorough review of my community compliance status. What she didn't know was that the federal personnel who would be present at our meeting would be a very different group than the ones she was expecting. Wednesday morning at 2 a.m., my security cameras captured Karen's final and most desperate escalation attempt. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be spray paint cans, she approached my house under cover of darkness to conduct what she probably thought would be the decisive blow in her harassment campaign. The footage showed her spending nearly 20 minutes vandalizing my personal vehicle with bright orange spray paint. Her message was impossible to miss. Federal overreach warning. Remove surveillance operations from family neighborhood painted in large letters across the side of my car. But Karen wasn't content with simple vandalism. The cameras also captured her attempting to disable what she apparently believed were surveillance devices by spray painting the motion sensors on my security system and trying to pry off the small cameras I'd installed around the property perimeter. The most disturbing part of the footage showed Karen using a crowbar to attempt forcing open my garage door. She spent almost 10 minutes trying to break into the space that served as my workshop and memorial to Sarah's tools, apparently believing she would find evidence of federal surveillance equipment. When the garage door resisted her efforts, Karen became increasingly violent. She struck the door repeatedly with the crowbar, damaged the weather stripping, and left deep gouges in the metal panels. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the neighborhood for several minutes before she finally gave up. But here's where Karen made her fatal mistake. She didn't just vandalize my property and leave. She spent additional time placing what appeared to be surveillance equipment of her own. The cameras captured her installing a small wireless camera aimed at my front door and hiding what looked like a recording device under the bushes near my driveway. Then she posted her activities on social media. At 3:15 a.m., Karen updated her Facebook page with photos of my vandalized vehicle and a long post explaining that she'd conducted a citizen enforcement action against a federal agent who was conducting illegal surveillance of neighborhood families. The post included detailed descriptions of her vandalism, claims that she'd disabled unauthorized federal monitoring equipment, and threats to continue community protection operations until federal presence is removed from residential areas. She even posted video clips that she'd apparently recorded while conducting the vandalism, narrating her actions like some kind of patriotic documentary. Here you can see the federal surveillance vehicle that's been monitoring our neighborhood for months. Community safety requires decisive action. Here's a federal crime fact that civilians often don't understand. When someone targets federal employees' personal property because of their government employment, it can be prosecuted under federal anti-terrorism statutes. Add in the surveillance and stalking elements, and the charges can escalate very quickly. But the real mini twist came the next morning when Karen knocked on my door at 7 a.m. to inform me that she'd neutralized federal surveillance operations and was now prepared to escort me and my family out of the neighborhood for the safety of local families. She was still wearing her black security uniform from the night before, but now she'd added what appeared to be a tactical vest and was carrying the same crowbar she'd used for the vandalism. Her eyes had a manic quality that I'd never seen before, and she was speaking rapidly about federal infiltration and community defense protocols. "The evidence has been documented and submitted to appropriate authorities," she announced. "Your surveillance operations have been neutralized and your cover identity has been exposed. It's time for you to relocate your federal activities to an appropriate facility." When I asked what authorities she'd contacted, Karen produced a thick folder containing what she claimed were reports to the FBI, Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and other agencies with appropriate jurisdiction over federal employee misconduct. The reports were elaborate fantasies, complete with fabricated case numbers, fictional agent contact information, and detailed allegations about my supposed surveillance activities. Karen had spent considerable time and effort creating an entire fictional federal investigation with herself as the primary informant. But the most dangerous part of her escalation was that she'd begun recruiting other people to participate in her harassment campaign. The folder contained signed statements from 3 individuals who claimed to have witnessed my suspicious federal activities and supported Karen's efforts to protect community safety. When I reviewed those names, I realized that all 3 were people Karen had convinced to participate in previous harassment activities. Her brother-in-law, the woman from her book club, and a neighbor from 2 streets over who'd apparently bought into Karen's federal conspiracy theories. The situation had evolved from individual harassment to organized group intimidation, with Karen serving as the ringleader of what was essentially a domestic terrorism cell targeting a federal employee and his family. That afternoon, I contacted Prosecutor Walsh and reported that Karen's escalation had reached the point where immediate intervention was necessary. The vandalism, the attempted break-in, the surveillance installation, and the recruitment of accomplices had created a clear and present danger that could no longer be managed through passive evidence gathering. "Connor, we need to execute those warrants immediately," Walsh said after reviewing the overnight footage. "This woman has crossed the line from harassment into violent criminal activity, and she's recruiting others to participate. Every day we wait increases the risk to you and your family." The arrest operation was scheduled for the following morning. Federal agents, local law enforcement, media coverage, and neighborhood witnesses would all be present when Karen arrived for what she believed would be a final confrontation with the federal agent she'd been terrorizing for months. What Karen didn't know was that she was walking into the most comprehensive sting operation in Willowbrook Estate's history, with enough evidence to put her away for years and enough witnesses to ensure that justice would finally be served. Thursday morning at 10 a.m., everything came together exactly as we'd planned. The HOA monthly meeting was in progress at the Willowbrook Clubhouse with nearly 40 residents present, most hoping to finally address the Karen situation. I'd coordinated perfectly. Federal arrest warrants were ready, Detective Martinez had positioned deputies around the perimeter, and Channel 7 News was set up for live coverage. The meeting had been discussing community garden funding when Karen made her dramatic entrance. She burst through the doors wearing her full security costume, black uniform, tactical vest, utility belt, carrying folders of what she claimed was evidence of my federal crimes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, interrupting the discussion, "I'm here to present critical information about federal surveillance operations conducted against this community for 6 months." The room fell silent as Karen marched to the front, setting up poster boards with photos of my house and vehicle. She pointed to motion sensors on my garage, claiming they were federal monitoring devices. She displayed photos of my work vehicle, insisting it contained classified surveillance equipment. But as Karen explained her evidence to the uncomfortable crowd, I stood up and activated my Bollard remote. "Excuse me," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly on the news broadcast. "I need to step outside to handle a security situation." Karen's eyes lit up with triumph. "Yes, federal surveillance operations are being exposed." She abandoned her presentation and followed me outside, apparently believing she was about to witness my arrest. Several neighbors and the news crew followed us, creating exactly the public witness situation we'd planned. As Karen approached my house, she muttered about federal accountability and community protection protocols. When she reached my driveway and saw my vehicle, still covered with her spray-painted warnings from 2 nights earlier, she decided to take direct action. "I need to complete evidence documentation," she announced to the cameras. She pulled out her crowbar and approached my garage, intending to demonstrate her authority by forcibly entering the building she'd been trying to breach for weeks. That's when I activated the bollards. The hydraulic posts rose in less than 2 seconds, creating steel barriers. Karen had parked her vehicle in my driveway, and her car was suddenly trapped between 3-foot-tall steel posts with no escape. The visual impact was perfect. Karen's sedan suspended between bollards like a carnival prize, with Karen standing beside it holding a crowbar, surrounded by news cameras and 40 neighborhood witnesses. "Ma'am," I said clearly for the cameras, "you're under arrest for federal charges of serial breaking and entering, vehicle theft, mail theft, harassment of a federal officer, vandalism, and making false statements to federal agencies." Karen's face showed complete shock. For the first time in months, she realized she wasn't controlling the situation. The federal investigation she'd been claiming to coordinate was real, but she was the criminal. Detective Martinez moved in smoothly, reading her rights while cameras captured every moment of what would become the lead story on 3 local television stations. I opened my evidence folder, displaying security camera footage showing Karen breaking into neighbor vehicles, photographs of stolen property recovered from her house, copies of fake violation notices she'd been distributing, screenshots of her social media posts documenting vandalism activities. "For the record," I announced to the crowd, "Karen Ashford is not an HOA official, has never held any legitimate community position, and has been conducting a criminal enterprise for 18 months. The neighborhood response was immediate and cathartic. Tom Henderson stood up, publicly describing fake fines he'd received. Maria Santos talked about harassment her family endured. Mrs. Patterson detailed theft from her vehicle. One by one, Karen's victims spoke up, creating a public record of her crimes that would be impossible to dismiss. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, still insisting she was a legitimate safety officer being persecuted, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. The bollards remained raised, with her abandoned vehicle serving as a monument to the consequences of fake authority. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, my sons watched their father being treated as a hero instead of a problem. When a reporter asked Jake how it felt to see justice served, he smiled. "My dad's the good guy. It just took everyone else a while to figure it out." The aftermath of Karen's arrest was like watching 18 months of neighborhood tension evaporate overnight. Within hours of the news broadcast, residents who'd been afraid to leave their houses were gathering to share Karen's stories and celebrate the end of her harassment campaign. The federal charges were comprehensive. 8 counts of breaking and entering, 12 counts of vehicle theft, 6 counts of mail theft, 4 counts of identity document fraud, 3 counts of making false statements to federal agencies, 2 counts of harassment of a federal officer, plus vandalism and attempted burglary. Her bail was set at $50,000, which she couldn't afford. The search of Karen's house revealed the criminal operation's scope. Federal agents found over $200 in stolen change, dozens of copied registration documents, 12 garage door openers taken from neighbor vehicles, and detailed filing systems cataloging personal information she'd gathered from breaking into cars and homes. Most disturbing was Karen's federal surveillance documentation project, hundreds of photographs she'd taken of my family, vehicle, and daily activities over 6 months. She'd been conducting systematic stalking while convinced she was gathering intelligence for legitimate oversight purposes. Financial restitution was $15,000 covering stolen property, vandalism repairs, and security upgrades families had installed to protect themselves from her harassment. The legal victory sent a clear community message. The real HOA board rewrote neighborhood bylaws with clear dispute procedures and strict penalties for anyone attempting to assume authority they don't possess. Community response went beyond legal resolution. Martha Williams organized a neighborhood watch program with proper training and official police coordination. The Henderson family started monthly barbecues where families could actually meet neighbors instead of hiding from fake authority figures. My sons found their place in this new neighborhood. Jake volunteered to help elderly residents install security cameras. Ryan started a lawn care service for neighbors wanting property maintenance without fake violation worries. The experience provided unexpected purpose beyond grief. The garage with Sarah's memorial tools became a workshop where neighbors borrowed equipment and learned security improvements. Pete taught DIY security courses, installing cameras, upgrading locks, creating simple alarms. The youth safety program established in Sarah's memory became Willowbrook's most successful community initiative. Kids learned stranger danger, vehicle security, and legal rights, but most importantly that real authority comes with accountability and fake authority should always be questioned. 6 months later, our neighborhood became the community Sarah would have loved. Kids ride bikes without supervision, families leave garage doors open while working, neighbors actually talk instead of avoiding eye contact from fear. The practical takeaway for similar harassment: document everything, know your rights, never assume claimed authority is real. Security cameras start at $50, motion sensors $30, hydraulic bollards $2,000. But the most important tool is documentation. Recording conversations, photographing incidents, maintaining harassment timelines. Karen received 3 years federal prison plus 2 years supervised probation, prohibited from HOA communities, requiring psychological evaluation before release. Her case became precedent for prosecuting fake authority harassment campaigns regionally. My family finally found the peace we'd searched for since Sarah's death. Boys thriving in school, I earned a regional promotion. Our house feels like home. Every morning having coffee in the garage with Sarah's tools, I hear kids playing and neighbors talking over fences, the sound of community protecting itself and caring for each other. Last week, I built a new birdhouse named Karen, because sometimes honoring justice requires humor. If you've got HOA nightmare stories, drop them in comments. I read every one. Some might become future episodes. If you enjoyed Karen getting deserved consequences, hit subscribe because I've got more stories where entitled people learn actions have consequences. Thanks for listening, and remember, justice tastes best served with hydraulic bollards.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.